Hello, YouTubers. I wanted to make this video because there's been a disturbance in the force, which I did not realize until yesterday, really. Now, back in October, TC Electronics slipped in a firmware update to the TC Electronics Plethora X5, right? Which is an effects unit that I've used quite extensively, and there were some features that I wish it had, and just they didn't have it, and I thought, well, forget it. They're not really putting out updates and things, right? In fact, a lot of my friends called the Plethora X5 abandonware, right? Because they weren't putting out firmware updates. Well, a little patience paid off, because as I said, in October they just put in a new firmware update. And a quick overview of what this firmware update includes is what we're going to go over in this video. Alright, now this comes directly from TC Electronics, right, who released the firmware update in October. But then, on top of that, have the release notes off their website. Okay, and this is for version 1.43, released October 19th. Wow. I mean, that totally skipped me by. They really did this under the radar. I hadn't heard of it, of any update for the Plethora. Alright. Now, what's included? Right? I mean, I've seen a lot of videos where they're going over, you know, how to do things and moving around, but no quick overview. Well, what does the firmware update give you? Well, we're going to go over that today. And the very first thing is tempo sync. Okay, now, in the past, basically the Plethora X5 just didn't deal with tempo really at all, which is a real shame for delay and things. But also, if you wanted to sync to MIDI clock, for example, if you had a little drum machine or a drum pedal or that kind of thing, it could sync to it and things would stay in time. Well, now that's included, right? They've also done a lot with tap tempo, right? Where you can tap tempo, including global tap tempo. And remember, there are 5 slots. It'll be very interesting to find out how that tap tempo works with looping, right? Remember, there are 5 slots. Each slot can be a looper. So it'll be very interesting to see how they treat each looper. Do they sync together now? We'll find out. Alright, so it seems they've done a tremendous amount of work on tempo and syncing, right? Including global clock, right? Tempo, right? That basically everything syncs to the global tempo. Let's see. Okay, and remember there are 5 slots, so 5 different effects, right? Each one can hold a different effect. And here they have some of them you can set independently to global tempo, right? And others can be without global tempo. So those won't sync unless you set it to syncing to global tempo. They've also added a tap/tuner utility pedal. And I think what that means is that where you select effects on the left side, it shows you chorus, delay. One of them will be the tap tempo/tuner pedal, which before was only built in, so you couldn't have access to it. Then MIDI continuous controller tap, right? So you can send it continuous controller messages now. And then finally MIDI clock sync, which is really great if you're using that kind of system. In other words, on my pedal board, I have a smart clock, right, that sends out tempo messages, global tempo messages, and all my pedals sync to that global tempo. And now the Plethora X5 can do that as well as again syncing to external pedals, such as drum machines and those kinds of things. Like the Beat Buddy would be a perfect example. So that's big news right there. So that's the first thing, right, is tempo sync. Okay, that's the first thing they've done. Now here we go. On number 2 is the tap/tuner utility pedal that we just talked about. And this is an always-on tap tempo pedal controlling the global tempo. Right. So in other words, you can tap a tempo in, and that'll affect the entire global tempo. Right. Before you had to press and hold a pedal before tapping. Now it's instantaneous. Okay. And now here's something interesting. They also made it easy access to the tuner via press and hold, which before you had to go through a series of clicks and hitting different pedal buttons and things to access the tuner. So now it's much easier to do. Alright. The third thing is expanded MIDI features. Okay. And of course the first one being the MIDI clock sync. And then now you can turn the tuner on and off via CC messages, continuous controller messages via MIDI. Right. And you can also virtually tap in the global tempo using MIDI continuous controllers. Okay. And basically with the continuous controllers, with the Plethora X5, now you can control most features, including parameters and those kinds of things. Alright, the next one. CC Global Expression. Wow. CC Global Expression. So, expression usually with an expression pedal now can be controlled via MIDI continuous controller. In other words, you can program the continuous controller to, let's say, control volume or control parameter of one of the effects, and so on. And that can now be done with continuous controllers. Okay. And then the next thing is continuous controller control of individual modifiers for each pedal. In other words, you can take a pedal, that's in one of the slots. Let's say it was a delay, and you can control parameter 1, 2, and 3, as well as mash, which is basically when you step down on the pedal, the harder you step on it, the mash will allow you to control changes, right, compared to the normal sound. So in other words, you could have your delay be a lot longer if you hold down the pedal button. Okay, and then of course the expression modifier we just talked about. Alright, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? 5 different parameters that you can change for the 5 different slots. Right, so that's a lot of MIDI control right there. And I think that's kind of the, the syncing of things is the major update of this release. Number 4, BPM adjustment of last tap tempo using encoders. Now this is very interesting, because this means that you can change the tempo. Let's say you tap in a tempo, you want 120. You tap in a tempo and it only comes up to 119. Right, so you're off a little bit. Well, using one of the encoders, you can move it up to 120. Right, and that is really helpful to being accurate. Okay, and then here's another thing: restore points. Kind of like in Windows, you can set a restore point, and from there you can load, export, or import, right, different sequences from the restore point to a known state. So this is good for kind of backing up things and that kind of thing, or if you create, let's say, a setup in your plethora that you want to save for later, you could save a restore point and then call it back at some future date. Okay, on top of that, then you have enhancements and bug fixes. And it lists a few bugs that are very specific that it fixes. So it doesn't really go into detail. And that's it. So notice no new effects or anything like that. It's all about syncing and MIDI. So this is a great firmware update, because people have been asking for this for a long time. The global tempo and syncing to that tempo. I'd be very curious to see what they do with the loopers in the plethora. Does that mean that if you put 2 loopers together, will they sync together or not? We'll find out. And then be able to use different external units, to work with the plethora, including drum machines, and just to keep the global tempo. So that makes this pedal really worthwhile. And that was one of the big criticisms that I had of it in the past. There's no MIDI syncing, right? A lot of the Line 6 pedals, for example, and we were talking big pedals, had no MIDI syncing at all. So you could never really sync a delay, to a correct time and that kind of thing. So this may not seem like a big update, but it is. Okay. So this is part 1. Looks like Santa came early, right? And put this firmware update in our stockings. What a stocking stuffer it is, right? So basically MIDI control and tempo, right? And MIDI syncing and that kind of thing. And that's really what this firmware update's about. Alright, so this is part 1. Part 2 is we'll dive into, see how it works first of all, what you can do with that. The MIDI control and those kinds of things. And the tap tempo things and the global tempo sync and that thing. Should be very interesting. And that'll be part 2. Because I just downloaded the update yesterday, and so I've got to load it up and see how it works and those kinds of things. Alright, see you next time. Okay, bye.